Let me tell you a story about Linda. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with strict rules, you probably know someone like her. She's the kind of person who always has her nose in everyone else's business. You might call her an HOA Karen. She loves rules. No, she lives for them. And trust me, if you step out of line, she'll be the first to let you know. Linda was the head of our homeowners association, or HOA, at Willow Creek. From the outside, she seemed polished and put together. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and her outfits looked like they came straight from a fashion magazine. But behind that smile, there was something cold, almost calculating. She carried around a clipboard everywhere she went, jotting down notes about things like overgrown bushes, cars parked in driveways for too long, or even wind chimes that were too loud. Yes, wind chimes. To be fair, not everyone minded Linda's antics, at least not at first. Some neighbors appreciated her dedication to keeping the community looking nice. After all, Willow Creek was known as one of the prettiest neighborhoods in town. The lawns were always green, the flower beds colorful, and the houses picture perfect. It felt like living in a postcard. But perfection comes at a price, and in this case, that price was freedom. For instance, take the mailbox incident. A few months after we moved in, Greg and I got a letter from the HOA saying our mailbox didn't meet their standards. Standards. For a mailbox. Ours worked just fine. It held mail, didn't it? But according to Linda, it was too plain and needed to match the approved design. We ended up repainting it twice because the first shade of white wasn't white enough. Ridiculous, right? Then there were the meetings. Oh, the meetings. They happened once a month, and Linda ran them like a drill sergeant. She'd go on and on about things like holiday decorations, only allowed between November 15th and January 5th, and lawn furniture, no bright colors. One time, she even suggested banning kids' toys from front yards because they disrupted the aesthetic. Disrupted the aesthetic? Really? But none of that prepared me for what happened next. One morning, I woke up to find Linda's shiny white BMW parked inside my garage. My garage. The door must have been left open by accident overnight. And somehow, she decided it was okay to use my space as her personal parking lot. No note, no explanation, nothing. Just her car sitting there like it belonged. I stood there staring at it, completely baffled. Was this some kind of power move? Did she think she could do whatever she wanted because she was in charge of the HOA? Or maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. Whatever the reason, it made my blood boil. This wasn't just about a car. It was about respect. About boundaries. And honestly, it felt like the last straw. That's when an idea popped into my head. A risky one, sure, but also kind of genius. What if I locked her car inside? Not forever, of course, just long enough to teach her a lesson. To show her what it feels like when someone crosses your line without asking. I glanced at the garage door opener in my hand and smiled. Sometimes, karma needs a little help. As the garage door slid shut with a low rumble, sealing Linda's precious BMW inside, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves. I knew this was going to cause trouble. But maybe, just maybe, it would also bring change. After locking Linda's car inside my garage, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. On one hand, it was thrilling to finally stand up to her. For years, she'd been throwing her weight around, making life difficult for everyone in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Linda wasn't the type to let something like this slide. She'd come after me, and when she did, it wouldn't be pretty. I decided to tell Greg about what I'd done. He was in the kitchen sipping his morning coffee when I walked in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, "you're not going to believe what happened." He glanced up from his mug. "What now?" Well, I hesitated, unsure how he'd react. Linda parked her car in our garage last night. On purpose, I think. So, I locked it in there. Greg nearly choked on his coffee. "You did what?" "Are you serious?" Dead serious, I replied. She thinks she can do whatever she wants because she runs the HOA. Well, not anymore. Greg stared at me, his brow furrowed. This is a bad idea. You know that, right? You're poking a hornet's nest. I don't care, I shot back, though deep down, I knew he had a point. She needs to learn that she can't just take over people's property whenever she feels like it. If we don't push back, she'll keep doing stuff like this. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. The next few days were tense. Every time I heard footsteps outside or saw someone walking by the house, I wondered if it was Linda coming to confront me. Surprisingly, though, nothing happened. At least, not right away. It was almost eerie how calm everything seemed. Too calm. Meanwhile, word started spreading around the neighborhood. People noticed that Linda's car was missing from its usual spot in front of her house. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe she'd gone out of town or taken it to the shop. But as the days passed, curiosity turned into speculation. Tom, one of our neighbors, stopped by one evening while I was watering the plants in the front yard. "Hey," he said casually, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "You hear about Linda's car?" I tried to act surprised. "What about it?" "It's gone," he said with a shrug. "No one knows where it is. Some folks are saying she got into financial trouble and had to sell it. Others think it might have been stolen." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. Weird. Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, I think someone might have taken it as payback. You know how she is, always bossing people around, handing out fines for the dumbest things. Maybe karma caught up with her." I nodded innocently, pretending to agree. "Yeah, maybe." But Tom wasn't done yet. Then again, he added with a sly grin, "There's a rumor going around that her car was spotted in somebody's garage. Can you believe that?" My heart skipped a beat. Had someone seen it? Was I about to get caught? I forced myself to stay calm. "Really? Whose garage?" He shrugged. "Not sure. Just gossip, I guess. But still, kind of funny, huh?" "Very funny," I muttered under my breath. As Tom walked away, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. This whole thing was spiraling out of control faster than I'd expected. What started as a harmless prank was turning into a full-blown neighborhood scandal. And the worst part, Linda still hadn't said a word. Every day, I half expected her to march up to my door and demand answers. But she didn't. Instead, she went about her usual routine, walking her tiny dog, hosting HOA meetings, and handing out warnings like they were candy. The only difference was that she looked off. Her smile wasn't as bright, her posture not as confident. It was almost like she was waiting for something, or someone, to expose her secret. And then, one afternoon, I saw her staring at my house from across the street. Our eyes met briefly before she quickly looked away. That's when I realized she knew. Somehow, she knew her car was in my garage, and she was biding her time, trying to figure out her next move. Whatever it was, I was ready. The waiting game was almost unbearable. Every morning, I woke up expecting to see Linda storming toward my house, her clipboard in hand and fire in her eyes. But day after day, nothing happened. It was like she was playing a game of her own, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The tension was suffocating, but at the same time, it was strangely exhilarating. I couldn't deny the thrill of knowing I'd rattled her, even if just a little. As the days passed, the rumors about her missing car grew wilder. Some people whispered that she'd secretly sold it to cover gambling debts, which, of course, wasn't true. Others speculated that she'd been involved in some kind of scandal and had to hide the vehicle. One neighbor even joked that aliens had abducted it. While none of these stories made any sense, they kept everyone talking and laughing. For once, Linda wasn't the one dishing out judgment. She was on the receiving end of it. But the real entertainment came from watching Linda herself. She tried to act normal, putting on her usual cheerful facade whenever she walked her dog or attended HOA meetings. But there were cracks in her armor. Little things gave her away. The way she avoided eye contact with me, the slight tremor in her voice when someone brought up her car, the way she hurried past my house without so much as a glance. It was clear she was rattled, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. One evening, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, Greg joined me. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "people are starting to lose respect for her. They're not scared of her anymore." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Well, think about it. Everyone knows something's off with her car situation. And now that they've seen she's not untouchable, they're starting to question all the other stuff she's done, like those ridiculous fines and rules no one asked for." He had a point. Over the past few weeks, I'd noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who used to avoid each other were chatting more openly. People seemed less afraid to voice their opinions, even if it meant disagreeing with Linda. At the last HOA meeting, Sarah from 2 blocks over actually spoke up about how unfair it was to ban vegetable gardens in front yards. A year ago, she wouldn't have dared say a word. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Linda wasn't the type to let something like this go unanswered. Sure, she was lying low for now, but I knew her well enough to know she was plotting her revenge. The question was, what would she do next? Then, one afternoon, I got my answer. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking against the pavement outside. Looking through the window, I saw Linda marching down the sidewalk, her face set in a scowl. My stomach dropped. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, staring up at the garage door like it held all the answers. For a moment, she just stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Then, with deliberate steps, she approached the house. Before she could ring the doorbell, I stepped outside, forcing myself to look calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Linda," I said coolly, "what brings you here?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "You know exactly what," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Where is my car?" I blinked, pretending to be confused. "Your car? What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me," she hissed, stepping closer. "I saw it. In your garage. You locked it in there, didn't you?" For a split second, I considered denying it. But then I realized there was no point. She already knew. And besides, I wasn't ashamed of what I'd done. In fact, I was ready to defend it. "That depends," I replied evenly. "Did you park it there yourself? Because if so, maybe you should ask permission next time before using someone else's property." Her face turned bright red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But instead, she took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "This isn't over," she muttered before turning on her heel and walking away. Watching her retreat, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief because I'd stood my ground. Dread because I knew she'd come back. And next time, she wouldn't hold back. The confrontation with Linda left me feeling like I'd just stepped into the eye of a storm. For now, things were eerily calm. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the chaos hit again. She hadn't said much after accusing me of locking her car in my garage, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not without a fight. Over the next few days, I kept expecting her to retaliate. Maybe she'd file a complaint with the HOA board or call the police to report me for stealing her car, though technically it was still parked safely where she'd left it. But nothing happened. Instead, Linda seemed to retreat into herself, keeping her distance and avoiding any direct contact with me. It was unsettling, like watching a volcano simmer before erupting. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzz continued to grow. People couldn't stop talking about Linda's missing car, and by extension, her increasingly odd behavior. At first, it was all whispers and side glances, But soon, people started asking questions outright. One afternoon, as I was pulling weeds in my front yard, Mrs. Harper from across the street stopped by with a basket of freshly baked cookies. "Thank you," I said, accepting the gift with a smile. "These smell amazing." She nodded politely, then hesitated. "Listen, dear, I don't mean to pry, but have you heard anything about Linda's car? Everyone's talking about it." I bit back a laugh. Of course they were. "Not really," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Why? Do you think something happened?" Mrs. Harper glanced around nervously, as if worried someone might overhear us. "Well, some folks are saying it ended up in your garage. Is that true?" For a moment, I considered denying it, but there was no point lying to Mrs. Harper. She was one of the kindest women in the neighborhood, and honestly, she deserved the truth. "Sort of," I admitted carefully. "Linda parked it there herself. I didn't invite her to use my garage, but when I found her car inside, I figured she'd realize her mistake and move it. Only she didn't." Mrs. Harper's eyes widened. "You mean she just left it there?" "Exactly," I said, shrugging. "So I locked the door. Figured it would teach her a lesson about boundaries." To my surprise, Mrs. Harper didn't scold me or lecture me about causing trouble. Instead, she chuckled softly. "Good for you, dear. That woman has been running roughshod over this neighborhood for far too long. Maybe this will finally wake her up." Her words stuck with me long after she'd gone. For so long, we'd all been afraid of Linda, the way she enforced rules, handed out fines, and made life difficult for anyone who dared step out of line. But now, cracks were starting to show in her authority. People were questioning her actions, and more importantly, they were beginning to stand up to her. The turning point came during the next HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs, with Linda dominating the conversation while everyone else nodded politely. This time, though, the atmosphere felt different. The room was packed, and murmurs filled the air as neighbors exchanged knowing looks. When Linda stood up to give her usual update, the tension was palpable. "First order of business," she began, flipping through her notes, "is a reminder about proper parking etiquette. Vehicles must be parked in designated driveways or garages at all times." Before she could finish, Tom raised his hand. "Actually, Linda, I think we need to address something else first. What exactly is going on with your car?" The entire room fell silent. Linda froze, her pen hovering midair. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "Well," Tom continued, undeterred, "rumor has it your car's been spotted in someone else's garage. Care to explain how that happened?" Linda's face flushed red, and for once, she had no snappy comeback. Instead, she stammered, clearly flustered. "That's none of your concern. It's a personal matter." "A personal matter that involves breaking into private property." Another neighbor chimed in, earning nods of agreement from others. The room erupted into heated discussion, with voices rising louder and louder. Some defended Linda, insisting she wouldn't intentionally misuse someone's space. Others argued that this was proof she thought she was above the rules she imposed on everyone else. Through it all, Linda sat silently, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. When the meeting finally ended, I walked home feeling both triumphant and uneasy. On one hand, it felt good to see the community standing together against her bullying tactics. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this conflict was far from over. Linda wasn't the type to admit defeat, not easily, anyway. And as satisfying as it was to expose her hypocrisy, I wondered if this victory would come at a cost we weren't prepared to pay. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and explosive. Word spread like wildfire through Willow Creek, and by the next morning, everyone knew what had happened. Linda's authority, once unshakable, now seemed to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Neighbors who had quietly resented her for years were finally speaking up, emboldened by the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. For a while, it felt like the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted overnight. People started questioning everything. Why did we need permission to paint our front doors? Who decided that mailbox colors required approval? And why was Linda the one making all these decisions in the first place? It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up frustration. But while most residents celebrated this newfound rebellion, others weren't so quick to join the chorus. A small group of loyalists still defended Linda, insisting she was being unfairly targeted. They argued that rules existed for a reason, to maintain order and keep property values high. Without them, they claimed, Willow Creek would descend into chaos. Linda herself tried to salvage her reputation. She called an emergency meeting, determined to regain control of the narrative. When I arrived at the community center, the room buzzed with tension. Chairs were arranged in tight rows, and every seat was taken. Even those who disliked Linda couldn't resist showing up to see how she'd handle the mounting pressure. She stood at the front of the room, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something brittle and fragile. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know there have been misunderstandings lately, but let me assure you, I am committed to fairness and transparency." Her words were met with skeptical murmurs. Someone in the back coughed loudly, drawing nervous laughter from the crowd. Linda pressed on, ignoring the interruptions. "Regarding my car, yes, it ended up in someone else's garage. But that was an innocent mistake. I thought I had permission to park there temporarily." "Innocent?" Tom blurted out, unable to contain himself. "You just parked in someone's private property without asking. That doesn't sound very innocent to me." Linda shot him a glare but didn't respond directly. Instead, she turned her attention to me. And then, instead of addressing the issue maturely, certain individuals chose to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Locking my car inside a garage is not only childish, it's harassment. The room erupted into arguments. Some shouted their support for Linda, while others defended my actions, calling them justified given her history of overreach. Voices overlapped until it was impossible to make sense of anything. Amid the chaos, I noticed Mrs. Harper sitting quietly near the door, shaking her head in disbelief. Clearly, she hadn't signed up for drama when she moved here. Finally, Sarah, the same neighbor who challenged the vegetable garden ban, stood up and raised her hand for silence. Slowly, the noise died down. "This isn't about cars or garages," she said firmly. "It's about respect. For too long, Linda has treated us like children, dictating every little detail of our lives. We're adults. We deserve a say in how this neighborhood is run." Her speech struck a nerve. One by one, people began nodding in agreement. Even some of Linda's loyalists looked unsure, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Sensing the tide turning against her, Linda grew desperate. "If you want to remove me as president, fine," she snapped. "But don't expect things to improve. Without structure, this place will fall apart." No one argued with her. They simply voted. By a landslide, the board stripped Linda of her title and appointed a temporary leader to oversee reforms. As she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, a cheer went up from the crowd. It was a moment of collective triumph, a signal that change was possible after all. But as the excitement faded and people filed out of the meeting, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. Yes, we'd won this battle, but at what cost? The neighborhood was divided, raw emotions lingered, and Linda wasn't the type to disappear quietly. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger. Walking home that night, I glanced at my garage and sighed. The car was still there, untouched. Unlocking the door wouldn't fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, opening it symbolized a fresh start. The days following Linda's removal as HOA president were strange. On the surface, Willow Creek seemed lighter, freer. People smiled more often, and conversations flowed easily without the shadow of fear hanging over them. For the first time in years, neighbors gathered for impromptu barbecues and weekend chats, rediscovering what it meant to live in a real community, not just a neighborhood governed by rules. But beneath the newfound cheer, tension simmered. Linda hadn't gone quietly into the night. Instead, she retreated into her house, drawing the curtains tight and rarely stepping outside. When she did emerge, it was with a scowl that could curdle milk. Her loyalists still whispered among themselves, accusing the rest of us of ganging up on her unfairly. She was strict, they'd say, but at least she kept things orderly. I tried not to let their words bother me. After all, change is messy, and no one likes being forced out of their comfort zone. Not even those who benefited from the old system. Still, there were moments when guilt crept in. Had I gone too far? Was locking her car in my garage really necessary, or had it only deepened the divide? One evening, as I watered the flowers lining my driveway, Mrs. Harper approached me again. This time, she didn't bring cookies, just a thoughtful expression. "You've stirred quite the pot, haven't you?" she said gently. I sighed, setting down the watering can. "I guess I have. Do you think I made things worse?" She tilted her head, considering the question. "Not necessarily. Sometimes, shaking things up is the only way to move forward. But healing takes time. And patience." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Healing. That's what we needed now. Not revenge, not punishment, but a chance to rebuild trust and find common ground. Yet, as much as I wanted that, I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. Old wounds don't heal quickly, especially when pride is involved. A week later, I decided it was time to release Linda's car. Keeping it locked in my garage felt petty now, like holding on to anger rather than letting go. Greg helped me open the door, and together, we stood staring at the gleaming white BMW inside. It looked untouched, almost mocking in its perfection. "Do you think she'll apologize?" Greg asked, breaking the silence. I laughed softly. Not a chance. Still, I scribbled a note and taped it to her windshield. "Your car is safe. Let's start fresh." It wasn't an apology. It was an olive branch. Whether she accepted it was entirely up to her. To my surprise, she didn't retaliate. Days turned into weeks, and though Linda remained distant, she stopped trying to stir trouble. The loyalists gradually softened, joining community events and even pitching in during the annual spring cleanup. Slowly, painfully, the neighborhood began to knit itself back together. New leadership brought changes too. The HOA board implemented a more democratic process, inviting input from all residents before enforcing policies. Rules became guidelines, encouraging creativity instead of stifling it. Front yards transformed overnight. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, vegetable gardens sprouted alongside flower beds, and kids' toys reappeared on lawns. Willow Creek finally felt alive. Yet, despite the progress, I couldn't ignore the lingering scars. Linda may have stepped down, but the resentment she fostered hadn't vanished completely. Some neighbors avoided eye contact. Others muttered under their breath whenever her name came up. And though I played a role in toppling her reign, I wondered if I'd done enough to bridge the gap, or if I'd simply replaced one kind of division with another. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching Max chase butterflies, I realized something important. Change isn't about winning or losing. It's about growth. Standing up to Linda wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But maybe that's okay. Maybe imperfection is part of the process, a reminder that communities, like people, are works in progress. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I allowed myself a small smile. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And sometimes, that's enough. Months passed, and life in Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm. The neighborhood wasn't the same as it had been under Linda's iron grip. It was better. Brighter. People laughed more, argued less, and seemed genuinely happy to be part of something bigger than themselves. But even in this newfound harmony, I couldn't help reflecting on everything that had happened. Linda kept mostly to herself these days. Occasionally, I'd see her walking her tiny dog early in the morning or pulling weeds from her garden, but she avoided eye contact whenever our paths crossed. There was no malice in her actions anymore, just quiet resignation. It was almost sad, in a way. For all her faults, she hadn't started out as a villain. Somewhere along the line, her need for control had consumed her, turning her into someone even she might not have recognized. One day, while picking up groceries at the local store, I ran into Sarah, the neighbor who'd bravely challenged Linda during the infamous HOA meeting. She waved me over, her cart filled with fresh produce. "Hey, stranger," she said with a grin. "How's it going?" "Good," I replied, smiling back. "You?" "Can't complain. Just stocking up for dinner." She paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Listen, I've been meaning to ask, do you think we went too far with Linda? I mean, she's been so quiet lately. It's kind of eerie." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Honestly, I don't know. What we did, locking her car, exposing her mistakes, it felt necessary at the time. But now, sometimes I wonder if there was another way to handle things. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, me too. Don't get me wrong. She needed to step down. But maybe we could have done it without making her feel like an outsider." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars twinkle above, I found myself replaying the events of the past few months. Had we gone too far? Or had Linda brought this on herself through years of unchecked power and arrogance? The truth was, there were no easy answers. Standing up to injustice is important, but so is compassion. Fighting back doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it means finding a balance between holding people accountable and giving them space to grow. And maybe that's where we've fallen short, not in challenging Linda, but in failing to offer her a path forward once she'd fallen. A few weeks later, the neighborhood hosted its annual summer barbecue, a tradition that had once felt forced and awkward, but now brimmed with genuine warmth. Neighbors mingled freely, sharing stories and laughter over plates of grilled burgers and cold lemonade. Even Mrs. Harper joined in, her basket of cookies earning enthusiastic applause. As I stood by the grill flipping burgers, I noticed Linda lingering near the edge of the crowd. She looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure whether she belonged. My first instinct was to ignore her, to let her deal with the consequences of her actions. But then I remembered Sarah's words. Maybe it was time to extend a hand instead of keeping her at arm's length. "Hey, Linda," I called out, waving her over. "Come grab a plate. The food's great tonight." She hesitated, clearly surprised by the invitation. For a moment, I thought she'd turn and walk away. But then, slowly, she approached, accepting a paper plate from Greg with a murmured thank you. We didn't talk much, just exchanged polite small talk about the weather and the quality of the potato salad. But it was a start, a small step toward healing the rift that had torn through Willow Creek. Later that evening, as the party wound down and neighbors began heading home, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. Yes, the journey had been messy and imperfect. Mistakes had been made, feelings hurt, and trust broken. But through it all, we learned something valuable. Communities aren't built on rules. They're built on relationships. As I tucked Max into bed that night, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, why did you lock that lady's car in the garage?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Because sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to make things better. But it's also important to remember that everyone deserves a second chance, even when they don't seem to want one. He yawned, already half asleep. "Okay. Good night, Mom." "Good night, buddy," I whispered, kissing his forehead. Closing his bedroom door softly, I walked back to the living room and gazed out the window at the quiet street beyond. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was ours, and maybe that was enough.